The old man built a new gate, but no one dared cross it, until a night beneath the moon. Out on a patch of land scraped bare by wind and stone, an old man had raised a gate no one passed through for 3 long years, until one tattered night at a slave auction he caught sight of a pair of eyes behind iron bars. No pleading, no tears, just a look that made him lay down the life he'd known. Emotional arc, shame, unworthiness, shown kindness, dares to live with her head held high. Core theme, a woman once treated as a thing, now for the first time treated like a person. Wind knifed through the gaps in old wooden planks, howling like a snapped fiddle string across the dust-haven valley. The earth was cracked and sun-scalded, blistered under the June heat, so harsh even the oldest cacti drooped in silent surrender. Inside a lonesome cabin standing in the middle of all that emptiness, nothing had drawn breath for years. No laughter, no horses, no comings or goings. At the end of a narrow hallway, tucked in the top cabinet, sat a small tin box, silver once, but dulled now, its edges worn. A red ribbon crossed its lid, sun-bleached nearly to brown. Dust blanketed it like a thin layer of snow. No one touched it. No one was allowed to, but every time he passed it, the man named Gideon Thorne would pause, just for a second, as if listening for something inside. Inside the box was a wedding dress, ivory, neatly folded, not a wrinkle or stain upon it. No longer new, but never worn a second time. No one ever saw him look at it, but he knew every seam, every stitch, every piece of lace at the collar sewn by his wife Sarah during one sunlit summer back when she still laughed in the mornings. The dress was a promise, a final one, buried with the gaze of the woman who once waited for him to return from war, then died on a wooden bed, hands clutching that same fabric. "Don't let anyone else wear it, Gideon," she had whispered, her voice thin as a dying ember. "Not because I'm selfish, but because it should belong only to someone brave enough to stay." No one had stayed since. Gideon had lived through 10 winters with nothing but his horse, a henhouse, and a ritual of folding that dress once a month, though he never opened the box. Partly out of sorrow, partly because he believed no one would ever be worthy of wearing it. Not even him. The wind changed. One sweltering afternoon he returned from Cotton Hollow with a sack of salt, some oilcloth, and a bundle of nails. Inside his saddlebag there was something more. A pair of boots, small, worn, but clean. They weren't his. They belonged to the Apache girl he'd bought for $5 from behind an iron cage, never once meeting her eyes as he did it. Her name was Ayani. She asked him nothing, spoke nothing. When they reached the ranch, she didn't walk in. She stood on the porch, eyes on the sand-covered steps, same as him, uncertain if her bare feet had the right to cross into anywhere again. As Gideon washed his hands in the trough by the horse pen, he saw her still there. Dust clung to her ankles. Sunlight slanted across her shoulders, outlining the bruises on her skin. She still wore the torn dress from the auction. Rope marks burned into her wrists. Gideon didn't gesture, didn't speak, but before stepping into the house, he opened the door, paused, turned, and entered the bedroom. He opened the cabinet, took out the tin box, didn't open it, just set it down on the kitchen table, like a quiet, flickering signpost. Ayani came in after, light as silence, not because she trusted him, but because he didn't stop her. They said nothing over supper. She ate slow, like each bite might steal her breath. He sat across the room, his back to the fire. Only when night fell and the wind hissed through the wall boards did Gideon speak, not with words, but by sliding the second wooden chair to the other side of the table. Facing him, Ayani looked at it, slowly. She didn't sit, but she raised her head. For the first time since being pulled from that market, she saw the box on the table, then turned away. No words were exchanged, but something in that house, once meant for one, shifted. Not trust, not rescue, just this. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looked at like a thing. And for the first time in 10 years, the box wasn't only a relic of the past. It had become a question, one meant for someone new. The box remained on the table all night, silent, unobtrusive, heavier than stone. What lay inside wasn't just cloth. It was time that hadn't ended, a life that had once belonged to two people, now whittled down to one. Gideon didn't sleep. He lay curled on the old chair near the hearth, the threadbare blanket too thin for a desert night. Wind slipped through the window panes like someone whispering just outside. The house was as quiet as it had always been, only now the bed was no longer empty. Ayani slept there, her face turned to the wall, not making a sound. She hadn't asked to sleep in that bed. He hadn't offered it. It simply happened. As if between them an unspoken agreement had formed. We will exist together, but not interfere. And somehow that silence stirred more than any spoken word. In the past, when night fell, Gideon would often stand before the high cabinet, his hand resting on the tin box, as if to make sure the past was still there. He didn't need to open it, just to feel the cold metal through his fingertips. But tonight he didn't rise. His hand dropped to his lap as his gaze followed the small movements of the fire. Each time the wood cracked, he blinked, as though waiting for someone to step out from the shadows. But that someone didn't return. Only memory did. Sarah was the first woman brave enough to live with a man like him. Rough-edged, uneducated, more familiar with a rifle than a pen. They met at a horse station where he'd been assigned to guard a convoy of salt wagons. She baked bread. He stayed silent, bought some, then came back the next day, and the next. He never took a single bite. Sarah never asked, but one morning as she handed him a new sack of bread, she said, "I don't need an answer. I just need to know there'll be a day you stop." And he did stop. Stopped drifting, stopped carrying a gun for coin, stopped everything to begin something with her. On their wedding day, Sarah wore no gown. There was no chapel, no witness but the sky, and the two horses tied beneath the eaves. But that evening she sat quietly sewing, a white dress, lace trim, high collar, puffed sleeves, something so lovely it didn't belong in a dusty kitchen. "What's it for?" Gideon asked. "For keeping," she replied. "For who?" Sarah looked up, a soft, sorrowful smile tugging her lips. "For the one brave enough to stay with you till the end, if it's not me." 9 months later, Sarah died of fever, under spring sunshine. Gideon didn't scream, didn't dig the grave. The ranch hands did that. He stayed inside, clutching the dress she never wore. From that day on, he moved through life like a man encased in ice. Each day slid through his cracked hands like sand. No one stayed. No one was invited in. No one was ever allowed to ask about the box in the cabinet. The next morning, when Ayani stepped onto the porch, the box was no longer on the kitchen table. But when the first sunlight touched the eastern window, it rested quietly on the porch ledge, beneath a thin cloth cover, right under the hook where her old restraints still hung. She didn't touch it, but she knew. He hadn't thrown it away, and without a word, she understood. It was the last possession of a woman who once dared to stay, and the only thing left in him still brave enough to hope that someone else might not leave. Ayani looked up at the sky. Not because she believed, but because, for the first time, after all the years of being bought and sold, someone didn't treat her as a price to be paid. 2 days' ride south of Cotton Hollow lay a stretch of land people only mentioned when they needed a warning. Dust Haven, where wind could peel skin like wire and sun bake the ground till it split fingernails open. Out there, if you weren't cattle or a horse, you were someone with no better place left to go. Gideon Thorne was one such man. His ranch clung to the slope of a low hill. No fence, no sign, just a winding path that ended in a yard strewn with broken stones. The stable was hammered together from the skeleton of old freight wagons, the roof patched with rusted tin sheets. The chickens didn't lay enough eggs. The corn never grew past his knee. Some mornings Gideon would stand in the garden, stare at the limp, sunburnt stalks, then turn and walk back in. Not even tired enough to sigh. He never waited for company and never expected anyone to stay. The last soul to step foot on that land was a doctor, 10 years back, who came to watch Sarah die, then left, never once looking back. After that, everything began to turn to stone. In town, folks had names for him. Silent Gideon, that crazed old coot, the man who guards a wedding dress. Drunks in the saloon whispered he'd killed someone and couldn't meet another man's eyes again. The baker woman said, he once loved someone so deep it near killed him. Now he just lives to remember. No one truly knew, and Gideon never corrected them. Each time he rode into town, he bought only what was needed. A few bullets, a sack of salt, sometimes thread. Never bartered, never looked folks in the eye, and when they sneered, scoffed, or spat, he said nothing, just counted out the exact money and turned his back. He'd been silent so long, people stopped believing he could hear at all. But Dust Haven had its own kind of silence. It said nothing when the soil refused to hold water. It did not complain when each year he dug the well deeper, but still struck dust. It gave no answer when he fixed the fences only for wild bulls to trample them again. Dust Haven didn't keep anyone. 3 neighbors once staked camps nearby. Now only blank patches of dirt remained. 1 rode north. 2 were bitten by snakes and never found. Voices, horses, the ring of hammer on post, they'd all slipped from Gideon's world like echoes of a country he no longer belonged to. Only the wind stayed, and sometimes the sound of his own breath, thin as thread, holding him to a life that wouldn't quite let go. The morning after Ayani arrived, Gideon rose earlier than usual. Not from worry, but because there were footsteps now, a second set, something he'd forgotten the feel of. He didn't glance at the bed, didn't check the porch. He walked to the coop, took the meager basket of misshapen eggs, rinsed them at the trough, patched the wind tarp, as always. But when he returned, he saw prints in the dirt. Small feet walking from the porch to the well, then back to the house. They weren't deep, didn't sink, but enough to say someone here hadn't left. Ayani hadn't said a word, but she'd drawn water, poured it into the jar beside the stove, and laid a cloth over the tin box, not to hide it, but to keep it clean. Dust Haven was the kind of place no one stayed long, but that day, Gideon noticed, someone had taken a step toward him without being asked, and for the first time in years, he did something not because he had to, but because he simply felt it should be done. He split extra firewood, so the house would be a little warmer. Ayani couldn't remember the last time she'd sat beside a fire. She had slept, barely, the kind of sleep carved into people who've been ripped from what once felt safe. Every creak, every shifting wind made her jerk upright like a hunted animal. But in this bare-boned cabin there were no shouts, no pounding hooves, no whip cracking through night air, only the sound of firewood splitting in the coals, like dry bones breaking. When she opened her eyes, she saw the second chair had been pulled closer to the fire. On the table, an old bowl sat upside down. Beneath it, a cornbread cake, still warm. She didn't touch it, not because she suspected it was a trick, but because she didn't believe it was meant for her. Long ago, when she was a child, Ayani had lived in a small hunting camp with her tribe. The women had woven baskets together, scraped hides, laughed with their eyes while sitting around the flames. There, food was shared, because hunger belonged to all. But in these past years, since the tribe scattered, since the day she was taken, people told her her body wasn't worth even a bowl of water, that her name, Ayani, meant nothing, unless it fetched a high price. Inside the cage at the auction, when men beat their sticks on the planks and barked, "Turn her around," she knew she was no longer seen as human. So when the stoop-backed man lifted her from the ground, without bidding, without counting, without a word, she thought she was still dreaming. Ayani didn't know who he was, didn't know what he wanted. He hadn't asked her name, hadn't told her to stay, hadn't stared too long. He simply moved about his chores, mending a torn curtain, stacking wood, hanging shirts to dry. He quietly set a bowl of water beside where she slept, quietly left her pouch untouched, quietly left the cloth on her head, didn't reach for the scars across her back, and that quiet frightened her more than any shouting ever had, because she didn't know how to repay it, didn't know what to offer back, wasn't used to kindness that asked for nothing, didn't believe she deserved it. That afternoon, while he hammered a new shoe onto the horse, Ayani sat curled by the fire, arms wrapped around her knees. Inside her chest was a tight ache, not quite fear, not quite hunger, more like the feeling of having dirty hands and being asked to touch something sacred. Kindness. She glanced around the room, then down at her hands, still marked with the rope's bite. She didn't dare wash them, didn't dare touch the bread, didn't dare lie flat, as if each of those things might steal something precious she wasn't worthy of holding. Then a breeze passed through the cracks in the wall. A paper slipped from the high shelf, fluttered to the dusty floor. Ayani picked it up. It was a drawing, faded, smudged, but clear enough. A woman in a wedding dress stood in a field of red dust, eyes lowered, one hand pressed to her chest. Behind her, a thin man watched. No one in the drawing smiled, but the image spoke something the man himself hadn't said. Ayani quietly placed the drawing on the table. She didn't ask, but for the first time she sat upright. And for the first time she picked up the piece of cornbread with both hands. In that cabin, on land where no one chose to stay, one who had nothing to say and one who no longer knew how to speak, sat beside the ashes, holding silence like a fragile promise between two souls long lost. The next morning arrived before the light did. No rooster's call, only the dry wind threading through an unlatched door. Ayani sat up at the sound of steady sawing outside. Through the dust-filmed window pane she saw him, head slightly bowed, pulling the saw with practiced rhythm, feet planted like an old fence post whose name no one remembered. He didn't glance her way, didn't ask if she'd slept well, didn't ask if she planned to leave or stay, didn't act like he was offering something noble or generous. But there was something about him you couldn't quite turn away from. Ayani stepped onto the porch, her legs still unsure, walking like someone relearning how. He didn't turn his head, but his hand slowed, just slightly, as if he was more familiar with absence than presence. She sat on the wooden chair by the door, her fingers brushing a tiny groove worn into the armrest. The carving was nearly erased by time. For L, she didn't ask who L was, didn't trace the letters, just sat, listening to the rhythm of the saw and slowly realizing someone else had once belonged here, inside the cabin that smelled of earth and held the bruised light of late afternoons mixing blood red with dust. Ayani slowly taught herself not to flinch at footsteps, not to brace at the sound of metal, not to drop her gaze when someone raised a hand. He didn't speak. But every day he did one small thing. Patched a piece of fence, swept the dust from the barn, stacked extra wood by the stove. She didn't speak, either, but every day she did one small thing, too. Washed the old bowl she'd used, swept the dirt from the doorstep, straightened the crumpled blanket where she slept. No one reminded the other. No one waited, but neither of them left. One afternoon, the sky cracked open. Rain came. He returned late, soaked through. Ayani sat by the door and watched as he unsaddled the horse, hung the bridle, and paused. Just a beat. When he saw the soft yellow light pouring from the window, the light she had lit when dusk first began to fall, he stepped inside, didn't say a word, but his eyes caught that light like a man who hadn't expected to see it again. That night he slept on the long bench, back turned to the wall. Ayani walked to him, quietly pulling the blanket back over his shoulder where it had slipped away. She didn't dare touch his arm, didn't call his name. Her hand hovered at the fabric's edge, like someone standing before a page, too old, too full to turn just yet. And for the first time since the day she'd been taken, Ayani didn't dream of ropes or auction blocks. Only the sound of water dripping gently by the door, and the breath of a man who said nothing, but never once walked away from the place he had chosen to stay. One windy day, a storm rolled in from the south, crawling across the mountain ridge like a herd of wild cattle. Red dust swept the valley. Gideon Thorne locked the horse stalls tight, barred each door, and threw a thick canvas tarp over an old wooden chest in the barn, one that hadn't been touched in years. Ayani didn't ask, but her eyes lingered when they passed it. That chest, worn with age, the lock rusted, one side scratched as if someone, once, had tried to force it open. Something in this house always felt like it was waiting. That night, after Gideon had gone to sleep, Ayani stepped quietly into the barn. She didn't rummage, didn't break the lock. She simply stood at a distance watching the chest, as if something inside was watching back. The lamplight cast a soft glow across its lid, illuminating a long, narrow gouge like the scrape of a fingernail. Someone had gripped it once, hesitated, then lacked the courage to lift the lid. By morning, Ayani was nowhere to be seen, not until Gideon stepped into the barn and found the door open. She was seated beside the chest, hands folded in her lap. Before her, a white dress now tinted the shade of old cream, lace at the cuffs, every fold intact, never worn. Gideon stood there. He didn't lash out, didn't snatch it back, didn't speak blame. He only looked down, his worn eyes steady, unflinching, as if he'd known this day would come. "Whose is it?" Ayani asked, her voice barely above breath. Gideon didn't answer right away. He stepped forward, gently refolded the dress, then placed it back inside the chest, like a man who'd performed the gesture 1,000 times in memory. At last, he said, "Sarah's." She left before she could wear it. He paused, eyes drifting into the lamplight. "She saved me after I came back from the war with nothing but shaking hands and a curse no one wanted to hear. I saved you because Sarah would have wanted me to." He didn't say where she'd gone, didn't say for how long, didn't say how he'd failed to keep Sarah from the fever that took her. Ayani said nothing more. She rose, placed her hand gently on the chest, then closed it without a word. That night, Gideon couldn't sleep, and she, for the first time, began to stitch something with her own hands. Not a wedding dress, just a small handkerchief, plain at the edges, but each thread sewn like a quiet answer to the dress that had never been worn. Gideon began to understand. She hadn't opened the chest out of curiosity. She'd opened it to see if there was still space for someone who came after. And that chest, for the first time in 9 years, was tied shut with a new piece of string. That morning, Ayani rose earlier than usual. She swept the yard, filled the water jars, gathered the storm-snapped kindling from the night before, then walked toward the porch corner. where something had lain untouched for quite some time. An old wooden sign that read "Ranch Closed." The paint had flaked off. The wind had split its edges. Someone had once hung it to sever ties with the world. So no one would come. So no one would ask. So no one would hope. But this morning she stood it upright. She didn't hang it again, only wiped it clean, then leaned it gently against the porch post, as if someone passing might see it and not be turned away. When Gideon stepped out, he stood there a long while. He didn't ask what she was doing, didn't tell her to put it back. He remembered how Sarah had once wiped that sign herself when they first came to Dust Haven, hoping someday the ranch might be a home to someone else. He just looked at the sign, then quietly reached for the old nail in the post and hung the sign back in its place. But this time he turned it around. The back had no words, just a blank surface, clean, ready to hold something new. Ayani smiled, barely, not enough to reach the corners of her mouth, just enough to soften the sadness in her eyes. Gideon placed his hand on her shoulder for the first time, not out of pity, not to keep her there, but the way a father places his hand on the child who just said, "I'm ready to go to market." By noon he hitched up the wagon, a small cart long buried in dust. She packed eggs, some honey, and a small list scribbled in careful hand. Things to trade in town, a list she'd never dared give before, thinking he'd never go again. But this time, he did. He didn't promise to return early. He only said, "Don't forget to bolt the back door." When the wagon vanished around the bend, Ayani stood on the porch, watching the trail. No one was around, just a few blackbirds in the sky. She turned back into the house and began cooking the soup he liked. That was when a figure appeared at the west fence line. Not Gideon, not a passerby, but someone who'd been at the slave market that day. The one who held the whip, the one who'd spat in her face while she was still behind the bars. He stood with arms folded across his chest. No apology in his eyes, only the same look she'd seen too many times. The look of someone who believed that those once sold would always keep their heads down. Ayani didn't run, didn't scream, didn't beg. She simply stood upright, hand tightening around the wooden ladle still warm from stirring, as if it were the only weapon she'd ever need to keep from going back to the cage. He stepped over the fence like a man who still believed he owned whatever he wanted. His boots sank into the yard's dirt, leaving prints that mocked the ground. No asking, no warning, just another man walking into a woman's life as if she were nothing, just like 3 years ago. Ayani stood on the porch, didn't move, sweat beaded on her brow, not from fear of being hit, but from a deeper fear that she might once again be made into something less than human. "Still remember me," he sneered, his eyes stripping her bare. Ayani didn't answer. Her hand gripped the wooden ladle, knuckles gone pale. "Where's that old man? You think I didn't know you were hiding here?" He stepped closer, voice thick with the delight of seeing fear. "Can't speak, huh? Still mute?" The wind rose, a northern gust flinging dust into their eyes. Ayani blinked, but didn't step back. In the fading afternoon light, the hem of her dress stirred, like a flag belonging to someone no longer in chains. He reached for her brow. Just one touch, but she lifted the ladle and struck his wrist, not hard, just enough to stop him cold. "Ah-ha," he growled. "Little dog's got teeth now?" Before he could climb another step, a low, slow sound cut through the air. The click of a rifle loading. Harlan stood at the tree line by the fence. He didn't shout, didn't rush, just stood there, an old rifle in hand and a gaze like stone rising after a long, hard rain. "This ranch ain't closed no more," he said, "and she ain't locked up now." The man started to sneer, but rifles don't sneer, and the old man's stare, That was the kind of thing that made bulls freeze mid-charge. A crow burst skyward and the intruder looked down, then turned and walked away, still muttering, under his breath. Ayani didn't move. Her legs were rooted to the earth. Only when his shape vanished beyond the hill did she exhale. But she didn't cry. Harlan stepped onto the porch, didn't say a word, just held out his hand, like he once had when offering bread. Ayani placed the wooden ladle in his palm, not because it had been a weapon, but because, from this moment on, she no longer had to face everything alone. That night, Ayani broke into a fever, not because he'd touched her, but because something in her body, after that single encounter, began to tremble, as if her skin remembered what her mind had buried. She curled up on the small bed beside the hearth, cold sweat pooling at her neck. The room wasn't large, but the darkness spilling from her memories seeped through every wooden wall. Harlan didn't go to bed. He sat in the wooden chair, pulled close to her cot, one hand on the pot of warm water, the other wringing out cloth to press against her brow. Every few minutes he'd change it. No words, no questions. He didn't need to know what had been done to her. Only this. When someone shivers that hard in a night that cold, they deserve to be stayed with. Sometime past midnight, Ayani opened her eyes and saw him there, an old man slumped against the wall, nodding in and out of sleep, still holding the damp cloth in one hand. The fire was fading. Orange coals flickered against the creases of his face. She tried to sit up. A cold wave of dizziness hit, but this time she didn't force herself upright, because the moment her shoulders tilted, a hand steadied her. Not firm, not forceful, just sure. Harlan said nothing. He added another log to the fire. The crackling of the wood was the first peaceful sound she had ever known while sick. Ayani leaned back. No tears, no panicked breath. She simply closed her eyes and let sleep take her. In her dream, she was riding on horseback, wind tugging at her hair, and behind her sat a silent man who never once let her fall. By morning, the fever had broken, but his hand was still there. Warm, steady, not because he wanted anything in return, but because he believed that someone who had once been treated like a thing could still be fully human. That morning, Harlan left a bowl of warm oats on the table and stepped out as usual. Ayani didn't leave her room. But for the first time, she didn't lock the door. The wooden door sat slightly ajar, enough for sunlight to spill in, enough for the scent of horse sweat, and the rhythm of a shovel working earth to drift in from afar. No one knocked. No one barked. Come out. Just a silence that had been made on purpose. A space left open should she ever wish to fill it. Among the patched floorboards and the scratched table, there was something that began to resemble a home. Not because it was lovely, but because it didn't push her away. Near midday, she stepped onto the porch. No shoes, no shawl, just one step, loud enough to hear the old wood creak beneath her heel. The old man was watering the mule. He didn't look up, didn't ask. Ayani sat down in the chair by the door, the one she used to think only men sat in. She sat in the way women weren't taught to, spine straight, chin level, hands resting on her thighs as if she had every right to be seen. All afternoon, they didn't exchange a single word, but Harlan nodded each time he passed. And she didn't retreat. As the sun began to set, the highland wind swept through. A wool blanket, threadbare and faded, was placed gently across her shoulders. Not quickly, not hesitantly. No one said, "Thank you." No one asked for anything in return. There was just an old wooden threshold. And now, someone else who knew how to step across it. Someone once seen as broken, now learning how to sit upright in the light. 3 riders appeared late in the day, dust still hanging in the air when their hooves hit the ground in front of Harlan Cole's porch. They weren't merchants, and they weren't local. One tall, one heavy-set, one with a scar slicing through his left brow, and all three knew exactly who Ayani was. She froze in the doorway, her face unchanged, but her hand gripped the edge of the chair until her knuckles went pale. The one with the scar stared without blinking. "Well now, still breathing? Figured you'd froze to death somewhere by now." No one invited them in, but they dismounted anyway, looping reins like the place belonged to them. Harlan stepped out from around the house. No rifle in hand, no threats in his mouth, just a look. The heavy one moved close to Ayani, just a stride away. "You ought to come back. That old man ain't strong enough to keep what's his, not once the others find out you're here." Ayani stepped back, half a pace, then stopped. Harlan didn't speak. He walked toward the water trough. There he lifted the axe still buried in the log from that morning's splitting. His hand didn't shake. His pace didn't rush. Not a threat, but no room for doubt. He was ready. The scarred man looked at him like he was a joke, but his eyes faltered when Harlan stood full and firm. Not angry, not afraid, but steady like the land itself. "She ain't going anywhere," he said. The three men left, not in a hurry, but they left words behind, sharp enough to keep Ayani awake all night. She sat by the fire, knees drawn beneath a blanket. Harlan didn't ask, didn't comfort. He simply placed a rifle on the table, cleaned, ready, and stepped back out to the barn like it was just another chore. Ayani looked at that gun like it was the first thing she'd ever seen, that wasn't meant to be sold, wasn't meant to scare, wasn't meant to make someone kneel, but to keep someone from having to kneel ever again. That night, Ayani did not sleep. The wind slipped through the door cracks, the horses shifted in the stalls, and the roof creaked under the strain of the night breeze. But all of it only made one thing clearer. She was no longer invisible. The next morning, when Harlan stepped out onto the porch, he stopped, not because of the rising sun, but because the firewood had been neatly stacked against the eastern wall, straight, even, piece by piece. Not the kind of job done out of obligation, but the kind done by someone who had lived in refugee camps, prison camps, or any place where order was the last way to hold on to dignity. He didn't say a word, just stood there for a moment, then went about his way to the barn. Ayani watched from inside, through a narrow slit in the door. Her heart tightened, not because he was angry, but because he wasn't. By noon, when Harlan came in, the smell of lard filled the kitchen. On the table, corn, cakes, not perfect, not round, but clearly shaped by someone who had taken her time with their hands. Ayani didn't look up at him. She stayed focused on the black pan, her back slightly bent. Harlan sat down, ate in silence. No compliments, no thanks. But when he finished, he slid the chair back softly, stood, and quietly added more wood to the fire. For the first time, not because of the cold, that afternoon Ayani walked to the well. No one watched her, no judgment in the air, no whistles, no barking orders, no chain tied to the bucket like at the market. Just a well, a rope, a bucket, and a strange kind of freedom so vast it almost knocked the wind from her lungs. She washed her hands, washed her face, and for the first time braided her own hair, not because someone demanded it, but because she wanted to. She baked bread, split kindling, washed cloths, mended his apron, not much, not polished, but each small act was her way of telling herself. She wasn't something picked up out of pity. She wasn't repaying a debt. She just wanted to stay as a person. That evening, 3 riders emerged from the northern trail, dust rising thick behind them like a storm rolling into the valley. Ayani was stacking dry grass by the horse stalls when she heard hoofbeats drumming steady. She straightened, hand pressed to her chest. an old fear rising like fever in a cold night. The man on the gray horse dismounted first, eyes narrowed like someone who measured river depth just to throw a stone, worn leather jacket, wide black hat, a voice like sand. I knew you were still alive. I told them anyone keeping you was asking for trouble. Ayani didn't move. The storm wind circled her legs, dust spiraling, the roof creaking under the groan of old timber. Another man spat near her feet, pointed at the scar along her neck. You think I don't know where that came from? Trash. Letting you live was charity. Ayani didn't back away. She remembered her Apache days, how her father taught her to fire a hunting rifle to protect their camp from wolves. That memory, buried under years of cages and silence, lit again, like a coal that had never truly died. She bent down, not for a rock, not for a stick. She reached for the latch on the horse stall and locked it tight. It was a small act, but it said plainly, "This is my home, and I will guard it." The dust thickened, dimming the horizon. The gray horseman stepped forward, hand on the reins, as if ready to ride through the yard. "Where's the old man? You think he's enough to keep us off you?" The sky roared, not thunder, but wind screaming down the valley, carrying red sand like rain. Ayani's chest ached with the weight of it all, but she stood firm, eyes locked on his. "He doesn't have to keep me," she said, softly but sharp as a whetted blade. "I chose to stay." From the ridge behind the house, Gideon saw 3 figures through the dust. He saw the girl, standing in the open before the porch, hands gripping an old hunting rifle he hadn't touched since the days he hunted with Sarah. He didn't call her name. He just walked, boots crunching firm against the dirt, axe in hand, like a man ready to clear anything in his way. "She's not a thing anymore," he said, his voice low as stone. "If you still think she is, you'll have to get through me first." The gray horseman reached for his gun. Faster than a blink, Ayani lifted the rifle, fired a single shot into the sky. The blast shattered the silence, tore through the red veil of dust. Her hands shook from the recoil, but her gaze no longer did. She hadn't aimed to hurt, only to make them understand. She wasn't someone to be shouted down ever again. The wind howled like Dusthaven itself stood with her. The horses reared. The men pulled at reins, faces disappearing into the storm. No blood was spilled, but something had been buried, the time when Ayani's life belonged to fear. When they were gone, she sank to her knees, hands over her face, and wept. Not from terror, but because for the first time she had stood, and someone had stood beside her against the storm. 1 week later, late spring, the wind carried the scent of new grass and the wet earth left behind by last night's rain. Ayani sat on the wooden steps of the porch. In her hands was a deep crimson penstemon, a wild flower that only bloomed on rocky edges, where sheep never wandered and people never bothered to look. It survived because it had learned to face the wind and to bloom without needing praise. Harlan was sawing through a slab of old oak. He hadn't said a word about that day, hadn't told her she was right or wrong. He simply left a piece of apple pie near the hearth now and then, before heading out, as if to say, another day here wouldn't hurt. Ayani lifted the flower, placed it gently into a rusted tin can hanging by the window. She didn't speak, didn't smile, just looked at it for a long, still while, as though sending out a thank you too quiet for words. As she stepped inside, she paused at the wooden chair, the one Harlan sat in most nights, his back to the door facing the fire. From the cabinet she took a cloth, wiped the chair clean, then laid down a small handkerchief, stitched in red thread, uneven lines. In the corner was a symbol, a mark of her tribe. Once it had been her root. Then it became her wound. Now she placed it here as something, allowed to exist. Outside, the wind stirred the flower on the porch. It swayed gently. In the fading light, a passerby might have mistaken it for a sign. A hello. An ending. A beginning. And if someone had walked past that wooden cabin just then, they wouldn't have seen anything remarkable. Just a girl sitting quietly at a table, and an old man splitting wood. But if they listened with their heart, they would have heard this. A person who had once been sold was now living as if she had never been turned away.